Hello, myself Sunil Ramakrishna. Here basically are discussing the PHP basically part 2. So one of the person told that PHP actually is the server side scripting basically that is connected to the internet basically. And till now basically we discussed lots of things that in PHP basically we can use HTML in PHP file basically we can see CSS in PHP basically you can use JavaScript in PHP you can use PHP data, PHP coding also because it's a PHP. So PHP basically we can use basically. WordPress basically is fully connected with the PHP basically. So what is PHP file? That basically we have already discussed. PHP is the extension. What PHP basically can do basically? It can create dynamic pages. One of the person told me, yeah, dynamic pages क्या है basically? What is dynamic pages? So dynamic pages means you can say HTML file is there. HTML file basically when you run the execute the HTML file that time basically it's a static basically. Static means you can't change the data basically of the display basically which is in HTML file. So that is basically statics. Whenever basically the web browser basically runs the data, runs the file basically .html, you can't basically change the file basically in HTML basically, but which is going to reflect to the server side basically. Through JavaScript basically you can change the content of the HTML basically, but if it's connected to the database, if you want anything from the database and you want to display in the HTML file, that is not possible basically. Why? Because it's not a dynamic. HTML is not a dynamic file basically. So PHP is a dynamic file basically. You can take the data from the database and dump into the PHP file and you can display the data in runtime format. So that is basically the major difference between dynamic and static basically. Static means static basically. The data can't be changed. In simple language basically. Static means what basically? English word. Static means simple basically. Static, no changeable. Dynamic means changeable. That's all basically. But here the word basically are into the software industry. So in software industry, static means HTML file. Dynamic means PHP file basically. So the PHP file basically you are when you are loading the PHP file, that time basically you can retrieve from anything basically from the database basically. So database is what everything that basically we are going to discuss basically. So that is the major difference between static and dynamic basically. And another is open file, read file on the server base. So you can basically read the files, you can open the files. Open the file means you can basically internally memory basically in you can, for example, one person told that I basically have yeah basically very big applications basically. That time basically I require the log file basically because when the data basically are getting loaded in the server in the web page basically that time basically we want to track lots of things basically. So track lots of things basically means you have to generate something basically in the text file basically. So from the text file basically you can open that text file in some Excel file or basically you can create some desktop application and just open the text file basically in the desktop application and field basic divide the columns basically and rows so that you can able to easily able to view the log file in the desktop application also basically. So this read file you can read the image file also, you can write the word file also, you can write the image file, you can write the Excel file, you can so everything basically you can do in Excel file you in PHP basically. So one of the person told that I want something to write in Excel file while running the PHP, so that you can do basically here from PHP. So there are basically many facilities basically given, so you can write in database also and you can basically write in Excel file also basically. So PHP basically can collect the form data. One of the person will be form data is what basically? Yeah, form data means you can say the text box is basically the form data basically. When you submit the, for example, there is one screen. In screen basically registration screen is that, and there are 35 fields. When you submit the register button, that time basically the whatever form basically data you have filled that should go into the database basically. So for that basically when you are registering, clicking the submit button, that time basically you are submitting the form basically. Form basically is everything basically it's there in the HTML file basically. HTML file basically when you might have learned the internet, that time basically HTML file was there. In that basically many contains basically are many HTML tags basically are there. In tag basically the form tag is there. So within form tag basically whatever data, whenever the submit button is there, submit button, when you press the submit button, that time basically the entire form basically gets submit to the next page basically. So when next page basically renders the request.form data or basically whatever command is of to getting the data, that time basically you can get the form entire form data basically. So there are basically many because if you want to submit the form basically you need the form basically the text box in which basically you have written whatever stuff basic. For example, registration screen is there. In the registration screen name is there, so it's name written, so you are submitting it basically, right? So that basically is the submission basically. So cookies basically concept everybody knows that basically. In the client side basically if you want to create any stuff basically, if you want to write any data at the cookies, that is basically called as a cookies. If you want to write anything basically with the permission only basically, they basically ask the permissions. So in permission basically cookies is the basically one of the stuff basically. In that sometimes basically cookies are internally permitted basically, but sometimes basically you have to take the permission because if the websites are very critical, that time basically you have to ask. And the websites basically are different country locations, that time basically because you are writing the data to the client side basically, and that's very dangerous basically. Why basically, that I will tell you. See this diagram basically. This is connecting to the PHP. If anybody wants to take the printout, you can take the printout and study 100 times basically. This is PHP actually. So take the printouts and study the file basically. This I will explain basically. This actually I have explained in my videos basically. In my lots of videos basically you can see in the my channel basically. In that basically it's displayed that how the if condition gets executes. That time basically how the if conditions are connected with the 1,000 cities. So PHP basically is doing the subscription of the if conditions. So whenever basically if PHP whenever basically the PHP file gets the power supplied to from the servers, sorry, server basically gets the, or the client basically gets the power supply from the 1,000 cities, that time basically the 1,000 city has not given the power supply and it has basically removed that if condition power supply, that time basically the if condition will not work in PHP basically. So that basically is given in this image file basically. So you can basically take that image file basically as a printout and basically you can study, because if you are doing any programming basically you should know up to what level the one programming files, one .php file is connected up to what level basically you should know basically, and how up to depth basically the programming is, that you should know. I will take one example, text box equal to 1,000 cities. So lots of people say, what you are telling here? Text to create one text box user control basically, the particular group basically has done lots of hard work. There have basically 1,000 cities created just to create one text box basically. To create one combo box basically it has taken 1,000 cities to create. So this diagram basically will help you basically to help you basically in learning the PHP up to the depth level basically. So in next video basically we are going to see little bit more about the PHP.